Good evening and welcome to this Caring for Creation webinar brought to you by Bethel Lutheran Church. In a moment, we'll welcome tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Randy Jackson. But first, we want you to help us have a lively discussion by submitting questions and comments during Randy's presentation. Just type your question or comment using Zoom's chat feature. On my laptop screen, there's a chat button to click at the bottom center. On an iPad, the chat button is probably in the upper right corner. When you click the chat button, please select the option to send your comment or question to all panelists and attendees, or to everyone, depending how it reads. And don't forget to click the Enter key. Now, here's Ashley Becker of Bethel's Caring for Creation Leadership Group to introduce our guest speaker.
Good evening, everyone. As Todd mentioned, my name is Ashley Becker, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. Randy Jackson. Now, before I formally introduce him, I want to add that Randy has been my graduate advisor at UW-Madison for the last 3 years. And I am very grateful for his expertise and guidance. And I'm excited that we all have the opportunity to learn from him this evening. I know it will be an engaging presentation. So with that, I'll begin by sharing a bit about Randy's background. Randy Jackson and his Grassland ecology group study how carbon and nutrients flow into, within, and out of grassland ecosystems. Randy grew up in Southern California, played baseball, and earned a BS in environmental science at UC Riverside, an MS in natural resource sciences at Humboldt State University, and a PhD in ecosystem science at UC Berkeley. He joined the Department of Agronomy at UW-Madison in 2003 as part of a 3-person cluster hire in agroecology. Randy teaches grassland ecology and co-instructs Introduction to Agroecology with Mike Bell, Claudio Graton, and graduate student teaching assistants like Ashley Becker. Randy co-leads the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, or WIXT, a 30-year-old experiment in Arlington, Wisconsin. And he also co-leads Grassland 2.0. A USDA-funded project working to transform agriculture in the upper Midwest to a system that provides for our wants and needs while cleaning water, reducing flooding, and supporting biodiversity, which we'll all get to hear more about this evening. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Randy, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ashley. It's really wonderful to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share. And I'm especially interested in this notion of caring for creation. It really is the spirit of the Grassland 2.0 project. We say it a little bit differently. We talk about it as caring for people and caring for the land, but caring for creation sort of captures all that. So wonderful to be here and to share and to do some co-learning, I hope, with folks. So the title of my talk is Restoring Grassland Agriculture. Sometimes I talk about bringing the prairie back to agriculture, and sometimes I talk about bringing agriculture to the prairie. And the research that folks do in my group kind of comes at it from both those directions, and this Grassland 2.0 project is no exception. The idea of Grassland 2.0, the 2.0 part, is that we as humans in fact, we have to have an agriculture that more closely resembles the original prairie, the tallgrass prairie in this part of the world. And by resembles the prairie, I don't necessarily mean that we have to restore the entire prairie intact. That would be wonderful. As a grassland ecologist, I love that notion. But we need the functionality, a lot of the functionality that the original prairie had. And so when we talk about function, I'm an ecosystem scientist, we're talking about things like building soil. We're talking about things like holding on to carbon and nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, to help clean up our waterways. We're talking about supporting and promoting and fostering a thriving biodiversity. And so we need agriculture that does those things to a higher degree than they do today. So I will spend a little time talking about where we are today. It is necessarily, I think, a little bit disruptive and a little bit uncomfortable, but that's where we're at. It's in many cases a pretty grim situation. But the thing about Grassland 2.0 is that it does offer a solution forward. So before I move on from this slide that I'm showing you, I just want to call out the other organizations that are part of the Grassland 2.0 project. I'm not going to read through them all here, but the University of Minnesota is a big partner in the academic space. And then most of these other institutions are NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have been contributing significantly to the project. And in fact, way before we got this 5-year grant to create Grassland 2.0, folks were doing this Grassland 2.0 work in these institutions for a long time. So let me come back around to this notion of caring for the land and caring for ourselves. I see it as an identity in mathematical terms, meaning one replaces the other perfectly. I think this is the notion that Aldo Leopold left us with, that when we take care of the land, we really are taking care of ourselves. And that when, and the corollary of that, of course, is when we don't take care of the land, we're undermining our own well-being and our own health. And so that's a fundamental precept for the Grassland 2.0 project. And in many ways, of course, we don't care for the land. We extract from the land significantly. This picture is showing one of the ways that we do that. And before I go any further here, I just want to make really clear, my showing you this picture of a farmer driving a tractor and injecting nitrous or ammonium nitrogen into the soil and disturbing and tearing up the soil is not to paint this farmer as a nefarious actor, as a bad actor. This is a humanity problem. It's a societal problem. It's not, this farmer acting poorly. This farmer is responding to the system that we've evolved and the system that we've, in many ways, intentionally created. And so Grassland 2.0 is about fundamentally looking for opportunities to change the system, to transform the system to one that rewards farmers for doing things that don't tear up the soil and that don't add excessive amounts of inorganic nitrogen into the atmosphere. One of the big problems with tearing into the soil repeatedly, disturbing the soil, often we say, with tillage like you see here, is that it liberates carbon that's been in the soil for a long time. Technically not fossil fuel carbon, but close to it in that it's been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The tallgrass prairie in this part of the world, the soils that accumulated under the tallgrass prairie continuously accumulated carbon and built carbon in the soils. And that is a tremendous amount of energy that makes these soils so productive for agriculture. But when we tear them open and expose them to oxygen, the microbes in the soil oxidize that carbon and liberate much of it to the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, CO2. So this cartoon is showing what carbon storage in the soil might have been like before the original plow up of the prairie. And then you can see a very precipitous decline in the amount of organic matter, which is another way of saying carbon, in the soil. Only 10 or 20 years on, roughly 50%, 45, 50% of the carbon that had accumulated under the prairie had been liberated to the atmosphere. And then, of course, we just kind of have a slow asymptotic burn here over the next 70, 75 to 80 years. And really, Grassland 2.0 is about trying to find agriculture that gets us on a new trajectory of building carbon rather than losing it, building organic matter rather than losing it. But what's very clear is that disturbing the soil is not the way to do that. Disturbing the soil is going to liberate carbon to the atmosphere. So we don't just care about this from an academic perspective. Of course, there are lots and lots of people trying to find ways to create, develop, deploy so-called climate smart agriculture. And I just show you this recent call from the USDA where they're making $1 billion available for so-called climate smart commodities that help drive more climate smart agriculture. And so, we might ask, what is climate smart? And for me, climate smart means that we're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into soils. There's an ongoing debate about whether climate smart is actually maybe just reducing the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere. That's a good thing, but what we desperately need, and we need it quickly, is to actually sink carbon into the soil out of the atmosphere. We've had some efforts to do that in the past that are pretty clearly not doing that. So first generation biofuels, which is where we take corn grain and turn it into ethanol to put into our gas tanks, is not doing that. In fact, it's been shown to be energy loss, and because there's so much carbon taken out of the atmosphere and put into, not taken out of the atmosphere, excuse me, there's so much energy put into making nitrogen fertilizer to grow the corn that it basically offsets any of the gain that we might get from the corn itself. Nonetheless, we now put about 27% of all of our corn that's grown in the US into our gas tanks as ethanol. We take about 40% of the corn that we grow in the US goes to feed livestock, primarily livestock in feedlots or confined animal feeding operations. And you can see the breakdown of where the corn goes to feed those animals. About 16% of the corn that we grow is exported to other countries, and I think it's important to note here that when I say exports, it's sold on a market, and generally speaking, sold to affluent countries. About 9% of it goes to food and industrial production. Largely, this is to make high fructose corn syrup that goes into soda pop and whatnot, and helps keep crackers on the shelves soft and pliable and sweet and that sort of thing. And then about 9% of it is residual. We either let it accumulate and eventually destroy it, or keep it in some sort of strategic reserve. So we grow a lot of corn, about 100 million acres of corn in the United States. This recent paper that was published by folks at UW-Madison, I was not a co-author on it, but several of my friends were. Chris Kucharik, the department chair, and the Department of Agronomy, for instance. They just examined what have been the environmental outcomes of this renewable fuel standard, which was U.S. policy, been U.S. policy since 2007. And it spurred a tremendous increase in the amount of corn that we produce on the landscape. And so here, this map in the upper left is showing where corn production increased as a result of the renewable fuel standard, cropland area, et cetera. The rest of these, I'm not going to walk through each one of them, but they're all looking at carbon emissions, nitrate leaching into the groundwater, phosphorus runoff into our surface waters. You can see that this increase in corn production has resulted in really devastating environmental impacts in terms of surface water eutrophication, groundwater contamination, and carbon loss to the atmosphere. I think I'll skip over this. This is just showing you where corn exports go. Again, the main point here is that most of it is going to countries where they purchase corn to feed the livestock. Here's a map of manure spreading in Wisconsin to bring it home a little bit, and a map of nitrate in drinking water in the state. And I guess the takeaway message here is it doesn't really matter where you go in the state, as long as you're in an agricultural region. The groundwater has a very high probability of being contaminated with nitrate. And just for context, the 10 parts per million, which is indicated here on this dark orange color here, that's the EPA's limit for what they consider safe drinking water. So less than that is still considered in the safe zone, but 10 parts per million or more is dangerous, especially to infants and to immunocompromised folks. This nitrate is coming primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from manure that's spread on agricultural fields from dairy. And you can see here that it's spread in the shoulders of the growing season. The shoulders of the growing season means the parts of the year when there isn't crop growth happening. You wouldn't spread the manure on top of the corn that might be growing there. But before the corn is planted in the spring and after it's harvested in the fall are these windows of opportunity when there's bare soil exposed for the manure to be applied to the surface or injected into the soil. Either way, when it's put into the soil like that, it is overwhelming the soil and the ecosystem's ability to hold on to it. Nitrogen is just inherently squishy in that it moves around and transforms very easily. Microbes are using it for energy in the soil. When they make energy out of it, they release a lot of that nitrogen back into the environment as a gas, a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, or they release it as nitrate, which is in an aqueous dissolved solutions phase, and that leaches down into the groundwater. So there's just more nitrogen being applied to the ecosystem than the ecosystem can hold on to. And it's with, again, devastating effects for human health and well-being. When we apply manure on soils that are frozen or somewhat frozen, and then we get some sort of thaw or melt, we have massive runoff problems. And you can drive around the state this time of year, and anywhere you go, you can find this sort of situation where you've got manure-laden runoff heading towards surface waters. And the problem with that is that the phosphorus primarily, but also the nitrogen that's in that manure-laden water, is fueling algal growth in waterways, and it's getting worse and worse every year. There's virtually no summer now where we don't have significant periods of time where swimming is not an option in our lakes and streams. Here's the Yahara River that connects Lake Mendota and Lake Monona. And here you can see it's turned blue-green, and Emily Stanley, my colleague at the Center for Limnology, dipped her bowl in to see what that looked like. And you know, it's more than impaired. It's almost unusable in terms of a fishery, in terms of recreation opportunities, and again, has been very devastating to our health and well-being. Likewise, those nutrients, then they find their ways downstream, down the Mississippi River eventually, and in the Gulf of Mexico, for the same reasons that it's happening in our lakes, those nutrients are fueling algal blooms that then, when those algae decompose, they take up oxygen from the water, and when the oxygen's taken up from the water, that devastates the shrimp, and that devastates the fish. And so the shrimpery and the fisheries in this part of the world, now known as the dead zone, the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, every year shrimpery and fisheries are drying up. So much so that there are now programs to bring the shrimpers up to the upper Midwest to introduce them to the farmers, to say, you folks are interacting, you're having a relationship and you might not know it. Let's talk about what that relationship looks like. The things that are happening on the land up in the upper Midwest are affecting an entire economy, an entire ecosystem in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's sort of the biogeochemistry, some of the biogeochemistry negative effects of the way we do agriculture today. I could go on and on for the rest of the hour talking about biodiversity declines, but here's one that's very striking. It's a study from 2019 that looked retrospectively at bird populations. And the takeaway message of this panel on the left is that since 1970, we estimate that there's been a decline of almost 3 billion birds in North America. And leading the charge in the loss and the decline are grasslands, which is shown by this brownish sort of curve here. Over 700 million birds lost, grassland birds lost. And grasslands are really where we do agriculture. And so this loss of grassland birds is not exclusively, but primarily due to the way we manage our agricultural landscapes. We simplify them, we reduce their diversity, we homogenize habitat, we straighten streams and creeks and that sort of thing. And all of that serves to undermine biodiversity, broadly speaking, birds in particular, pollinators, bees, fish, trout, the whole thing, the whole list of biodiversity that you might want to conjure up. There really isn't any sort of wildlife that responds positively to the way we manage our agricultural systems. And so one might ask, why is this? Certainly people are getting rich off of this system if this is the case. And yet when we look at the data of the profitability of growing corn, and I'm picking on corn here because it's probably the most obvious thing to pick on, but I could also put soybeans in this category or wheat. When we look at the profitability of corn, you kind of have to squint at this for a minute to see that the blue line here is what the USDA calls the Northern Crescent. And the Northern Crescent is the upper Midwest, but also the Northeast over here, as you can see on the map. And what you see going back to 1996 is that there really are only 1, 2, 3, 4 years out of 26 or 27 years that corn has been profitable, which is kind of an astounding thing given all that environmental degradation that I just laid out. It was profitable in those 4 years because they call those the biofuel boom years. It's related to that renewable fuel standard business when the price of corn shot up and people really went wild planting corn and made some good money on it. But on average, you can see that it's not particularly profitable. Now, of course, the government pays, brings this up to above zero every year with payments and insurance programs that taxpayers largely support, not exclusively, but largely taxpayer support. I guess my main point here is, again, not to throw farmers under the bus. They're responding to a system that's been de-risked, that's been insured, and it's being pushed. It's being promoted by our policies. And so we have an opportunity to change the landscape to one that's not so environmentally degrading with policies. And I want to say it's as simple as that because I know that it's not simple. It's one of the toughest nuts to crack. That's numbers, that's average numbers, et cetera. But this hits home too. It's people. It's farms going out of business. This goes back to 2018, but I think it could have been the case for the last couple of years as well. Wisconsin leads the nation in farm bankruptcies, and largely because of dairy farm closings. It's just been devastating to the farming communities and the farmers themselves. Look at the numbers here for Rock and Walworth counties from 1975 to it looks like 2018 or 2019. This is the number of farms in those counties back in 1975 and the number of farms back in 2018 or 2019. Wisconsin has been losing over 350 farms a year, almost a farm a day. Did I get that right? Yeah. Almost a farm a day for the last 30 years. At the current rate of farm loss, by the year 2035, if we kind of continue the trend, there will be 5 dairy farms left in the state. And that consolidation is part of the problem. And again, why? As the Cap Times had on their cover a couple of years ago now, there's simply too much production. There's too much supply of milk. There's more supply than there is demand. And again, this is not to paint anybody into a corner as nefarious. It's just the system we have that rewards and incentivizes production, production, production over profit and over the environment and other sustainability outcomes. And our dairy industry and our dairy scientists have been amazingly successful at finding ways to continue to increase milk production overall, and to continue to increase production on a per cow basis. So if you looked at the number of cows in Wisconsin, it's actually flat, but the production continues to go up because we get better and better at extracting milk out of the system. But we're doing that at an exorbitant cost to our health and well-being, to the environment. That consolidation that I've been talking about, it can be seen here in these data, which show the confined animal or concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, which in Wisconsin is defined as a farm operation that has 1,000 head of animals confined into a single building or a single set of buildings. So you can see here back in 1994, there were 5 or 6 of those scattered around southern Wisconsin. And by 2017, I don't even know how many are on this map, but at least several hundred. And concentrated in parts of the state that are the worst places for these concentrated animal feeding operations to be. And I say that because the soils in this part of the world, the Kewaunee County and Door County area up here, the soils are about 6 inches thick in most of those places. And below that is this bedrock that is fractured and porous, almost like a sieve or a colander. And below that is the groundwater. And the manure gets spread on those 6-inch thick soils. The crops cannot keep up with the nutrients, and it goes right through those sieves and into that groundwater. Just devastating for local communities. And the devastation isn't just in terms of pollution, it's in terms of community vitality. Small towns, small burgs basically shrivel up. Their tax base is undermined, their education system is undermined, people move away, people want to get out. And so we see a lot of this kind of situation across our rural communities. And this has a really, this is a really important thing for community health and well-being, for community vitality, both as a state, but as for these local places. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now with what I often jokingly refer to as the Bernie Sanders part of my talk, where I rail about all the problems associated with the way we do our industrial agriculture today. It really has been an amazing experiment in how efficient and productive can we make the system. And we've been amazingly successful, but largely by ignoring the environmental devastation that has resulted. So what would a sustainable ag system look like, you might ask? It would certainly be profitable, and it would be profitable in ways that individual farms and farm families could stay in business, not only stay in business, but thrive and grow, and not necessarily grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but grow in ways that are self-actualizing. And that would stimulate the rural growth and prosperity of the communities so that we would have thriving, vital rural communities. They would produce, sustainable ag would produce high quality products that would support a diversity of emerging markets and existing markets and that sort of thing. It would help retain and build soil and nutrients rather than wearing them away, which would help us promote clean surface and groundwater. They would help build soil carbon, drawing down the atmospheric CO2. They would support biodiversity, including soil microbes, bees, birds, and people. And this is a critical element of this Grassland 2.0 notion. That is that as we transform our agricultural system to one that is more sustainable, we have to at the same time transform it so that it's, let me just say, demographically more representative of the people that we are. So I don't have the statistics at the top of mind here, but I will say that about 99% of agriculture is white and older folks. And as those folks turn over, as we have generational turnover, we must diversify the sector, not only for the well-being of the sector, but the well-being of society overall. And we think that one of the best ways to address all this is to really connect people to the land and connect them to the food and where the land, connect them to their food and the land where their food comes from. And so that's a big part of what we're doing in Grassland 2.0, or at least trying to do in Grassland 2.0. Let me transition a little bit here to some research that my group has been doing, and it's building on lots and lots of past work that other folks in the agronomy department at UW-Madison have done. So the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial is this 30-year experiment that's been up at Arlington, just north of Madison here, since 1989. Josh Posner was my colleague who passed away, 8 years ago now. He started this experiment, and it was just amazing foresight and acumen to get this in the ground. And his students and staff and colleagues have been taking care of it ever since. The experiment it's two main types of systems: cash grain systems, where you grow grain crops and sell it on the market, and dairy forage systems, where you're growing crops to feed to livestock, primarily dairy. And you can see here that as we move left to right, we're increasing the diversity in the cropping systems. And as we move from the top down, we're increasing the perenniality. And by perenniality, we mean there's less and less soil disturbance. When we plant annual grain crops year in, year out, you're disturbing that soil, like I talked about at the beginning, and potentially liberating carbon off to the atmosphere. So we have continuous corn, the same plots, 4 replicates of these plots every year for 30 years. And then we have a corn and soybean rotation where we have 4 plots in corn and 4 in soybean that are rotating every year. And then an organic system, that's why it's gold. That's corn, soybeans, followed by wheat cover crops. That is wheat that's planted for the late fall, in the fall after harvest of the soybeans. And then we come in with clover to get some nitrogen into the system. Clover fixes nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And then we go back into corn, and that clover brings nitrogen into the system biologically rather than injecting nitrogen into the system for the corn. So that's an organic grain rotation. The continuous corn and the corn and beans are managed in a very high input, high intensivity way. Lots of fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides and the best genetics every year, et cetera. Similarly, the corn with 3 years of alfalfa is a rotation that's managed in a sort of high input kind of way. We have this organic corn alfalfa rotation that has oats as a cover crop between the corn and alfalfa years, again, managed organically. And then we have a rotational grazing treatment. Again, 4 replicates of this. So we have 4 different plots where rotational grazing on grassland pastures is happening. So these don't get disturbed. The soil doesn't get disturbed every year. It's the same grass growing year after year after year. So it's an amazing long-term experiment, an amazing resource. We were lucky enough that back in 1989, they took these 1 meter deep soil cores, and in this part of the world, the soil goes down to 1 meter. At 1 meter, you hit the glacial till that the glaciers left behind as they receded, or they pushed down and then receded. They left all this rubble and material down there. So really the soil itself is about 1 meter deep, and you can see here, Harry Reid is dissecting that soil into different increments, but you can see the deeper soil, or the shallower soils here much, much darker than the 1 meter deep soils. Nonetheless, these soils developed underneath tallgrass prairie for about 3,000, 4,000 years. So they accumulated an immense amount of carbon over that period. And when we put it into agriculture, of course, a lot of that carbon was liberated, as I talked about. Dr. Greg Sanford came in 2009 and resampled these sites some 20 years after they were established and looked at how carbon changed over that 20-year period. Here's Greg. So here's the main event from his PhD work, his dissertation work. The y-axis here is change in soil organic carbon in tons per hectare from 89 to 2009 across the entire 1 meter deep horizon. And these are the 6 treatments that I just walked you through, experimental treatments. And what you can see here, without staring at it very long, is that all of the treatments except for the pasture had lost a significant and high amount of carbon over that 20-year period. We have lots of questions about why this might be. Some of it's likely related to the management. Some of it's likely related to the changing climate. But for sure, it's related to the fact that the soils get disturbed frequently. The cool season pasture was neither gaining nor losing carbon in a statistical sense. These error bars overlap 0, so we say it didn't significantly gain or lose. What's interesting about the pasture is that surface the surface 30 centimeters of soil was significantly gaining carbon during this period. But from 30 to 90 centimeters or 30 to 100 centimeters, those soils were significantly losing carbon. And this gets back to this thing about, is it a climate change signal? We're wondering if there aren't enough roots getting below 30 centimeters to feed carbon down to the depths. Anyway, ongoing questions, lots of grad students who are exploring these kinds of questions, but the takeaway message itself is pretty unsettling, that our annual cropping systems, or the systems that get disturbed frequently, are losing a significant amount of soil carbon. So Ashley, who was so gracious to introduce me tonight, just finished her master's degree and is now embarked on a PhD working in this soil carbon space. Her master's degree was looking at, instead of this intensive experimental site that we have, Wicks, she went around to over 30 sites, and I should let her take over here and give this part of the talk because this is her work. But she went around to these 30 plus sites, and they were all grazing farms. She interviewed the graziers, the farmers, learned about their methods, learned about how long they've been grazing, how long they were in pastures. One of the criteria was that they had to be there longer than 3 years. They had to be in pastures longer than 3 years. But she worked really hard to then pair each pasture with a nearby site that was in some sort of annual row crop that gets disturbed frequently, and did her due diligence to make sure that they were on the same soil type and that maybe the pasture used to be managed the same way as the row crop, et cetera, et cetera. And again, she looked at the 0 to 15 centimeter increment and the 15 to 30 centimeter increment. And here's what she found. This is the 0 to 15 centimeter increment, and this bar represents the difference between the pasture and the row crop pair. And so this is the average difference between those pairs. And you can see that the average difference was positive, meaning that the pastures had a lot more carbon, significantly more carbon, in that 15 centimeter depth than the row crop pair. 12 megagrams, 12 tons of carbon per hectare. That is a lot more carbon than that was in the row crops. Interestingly, in that 15 to 30 centimeter depth, no significant difference between the row crops and the pasture, which I think is kind of a testament to these paired sites were pretty close to each other in terms of their long-term history, and that this difference in the surface is likely due to the fact that there's pastures established. So I actually got this work published recently in the Soil Science Society of America journal, and she's continuing to explore questions about why might this be? What are some of the mechanisms for this? How long does a pasture have to be in place before it starts accumulating carbon, et cetera? I'm sure she would love to tell you all about her research sometime and talk more about what she's doing. Yichao Rui was a postdoctoral associate that worked with us back at the WICS plots, the long-term cropping system plots. And he dug into the mechanisms here a little bit because he was really curious about why it is that Greg was seeing loss of carbon everywhere except for the pasture. And one of the really interesting things that he found was that a certain kind of carbon in the soil that we call MAOM, mineral associated organic matter, this is carbon that's kind of glommed onto silt and clay particles, and we think of it as more stabilized. I have it in quotes because we know that it's not like locked up forever, but it's more stable, and that it's harder for microbes to get at it. There was just a lot more of that in the pastures, and so now we have more grad students who are kind of digging into this. Why is it that there's more of this MAOM accumulating under the pastures? Is it because the pasture roots are more diverse? Is it because the pasture roots are more plentiful? Is it because of the excrement that's coming in from the livestock that are grazing, stimulating the microbes? All kinds of fascinating hypotheses that people are digging into. Another super grad student who worked with Chris Kucharik, but I was thrilled to be part of her research committee and help her a little bit with her work. She looked at the Yahar River watershed, which is the watershed that we sit in here in Dane County, or around the lakes, that is. Dane County is bigger than Yahar River watershed. And she was looking at where phosphorus comes from in the watershed to go into the lakes. Remember, I showed you the runoff. And you can see if you look in the northern parts of the Yahar River watershed that there are some really intensive places where phosphorus is coming, running off and getting into our surface waters. Tracy used a model, a simulation model, a mathematical tool to explore a question, which was, what would it take to meet our EPA goals for cleaning up the lake water? There's so much phosphorus coming in from the watershed into the water bodies. What kind of land use might actually improve things? And she found a fascinating result. To meet the EPA mandated so-called total maximum daily load for phosphorus goals, by the year 2070, we would need a 50% reduction in the number of animals in the watershed and 50% of the ag land in perennial grass. Now, perennial grass is good at taking up nitrogen and keeping it in the system, but it's also good at stopping soil loss. And when soil is lost, it takes phosphorus with it. So perennial grass just has this special place in our agricultural systems because it's quite productive, but also holds on to soil and nutrients, and at least holds on to carbon, and in some cases maybe even builds carbon. So Tracy's results were fairly startling to us because, you know, we always have this sense like if we could just get some more grassland on the landscape, we would be making a dent in the problem. But her results kind of made us step back and think, we need a massive transformation of the landscape. This is not a problem that we can address with incremental changes, with little tweaks to the system here and there. It's a problem that's going to require fundamental change in the way we do agriculture. And of course, the pushback that I get a lot is when I tell these stories and show these data is, yeah, but people need to make a living. You know, it's fine to say we can't extract so much, but people need to make a living. Jean-Paul Shabazz, shown here as a economist in our Department of Ag and Applied Econ, he looked at the WICS experiment back in 2009, and here are those same treatments, and he ran the numbers basically to show that when systems like grain crops are receiving government payments, and when the organic systems are receiving what he called an organic premium back then, compared to the rotational grazing that was happening on the perennial grasslands, the organic systems and the grazing systems were the most profitable on a dollars per hectare basis. So it's not just the dollars, you know, it's not just I'm chasing after whatever's the most profitable thing. There's something different. There's something more to it than that. And that's one of the things that we're exploring in Grassland 2.0. If you strip away the government payments that come to help de-risk and ensure corn and soybean production, the rotational grazing system was hands down the most profitable system, at least in this particular instance when John Paul looked at the work. Tom Kriegel's another economist, now retired from the Center for Dairy Profitability. He didn't look just at WICS, he looked at over a 14, 15-year period, actual financial numbers from grazing, organic, and confinement operations in the state. And I'm not gonna walk through all this, it's just to show that he actually had all of their data. And it was from 7 to 43 grazing dairies per year and 60 to 90 confined dairies. 304 to 721 confined dairies. There was a lot of farms, and these are the averages. And the takeaway is the net farm income from operations, which is another way of saying profit, was almost twice as high in the grazing system on a per cow basis as it was in the confined system. So again, it's not just about like, show me the money, I can make money one way and this is the way I'm going to do it. There are profitable ways to do it that help take care of the environment. And yet there's something else that's driving the decisions that people make. I'm going to skip past that. So we're bullish about grasslands because it holds on to soil. Maybe it helps build carbon. Take carbon out of the atmosphere, perhaps, as Ashley's results may have pointed to. Holds on to phosphorus, holds on to nitrogen, supports biodiversity, birds and bees and whatnot. I haven't shown you data, but take my word for it, they do much better in grasslands. And it can be very, very productive. This fellow, Greg Van Duvel, is up near Green Bay and has 130 milk cows. This fellow is Adam Abel. He's a NRCS state grazing land specialist. And I told Greg I was going to tell people this story, so don't recoil too much. But Craig was ready to go out of business. He was ready to call it quits. He'd had it. The price of milk was such that it wasn't covering his costs. He was a confinement operation. He grew all of his own feed, imported it when he needed to, etc. But he was ready to give it up and had inherited the farm from his folks and that sort of thing. Adam got with him and said, let's talk about how we can reduce your cost of production, the costs of feeding the cows. It's with grassland. And not only that, we can cost share it because it's so good for the environment, on and on and on. Craig basically says, not only did it save his operation, it saved his family's way of life. He said the best thing about it is that when he comes out in the morning, he milks the cows, which he still likes to do. And then he lets them out into the pasture, make sure the fences are in place and everything like that. And then he goes and lays down and takes a nap. And he said, that's not the way farming was before. It was harried and scurrying. And he said, I'm not here to say farming's easy now, but it's a different quality of life. And a lot of people have witnessed this sort of thing over the years. Young people are drawn to grassland agriculture. They're drawn to agriculture that can be part of the solution and not part of the problem. This is one example of a group of students that I took out to Dick Cates' farm out in Spring Green. Dick and I used to teach grassland ecology together, and he would host us out there every year. And every year there were a few farm kids, and they kind of knew about grassland grazing and whatnot. But most of the kids, the students, I should say students, not kids, most of the students were suburban students, and had never really been on a farm before, and their jaws are literally dropped when they see this kind of farming. This kind of farming that there's birds thriving all around, and Dick has what's now been classified as a trout one fishery stream, creek that runs through his farm, and he's cleaned up the waterways, and it's just an amazing system, and young people are drawn to this and want to be part of it. Megan here, I always draw a blank on her last name, but her father, Bert Paris, is organic grazier, dairy grazier down in Belleville, just south of Madison. And here a Canadian broadcasting crew is interviewing her and recording her story, because Megan had basically fled the farm, went to university, said, I don't want anything to do with the farm. She grew up on the farm before it had gone to grazing. She didn't want any part of it. Her dad came around to grazing. That's another long story, but he came around to grazing. And as she came back to the farm, realized that it was now the ideal place for her to raise her kids and to raise her family. She's taking over the farm, moving home, quitting her job in the city and coming back. So it's agriculture as a solution. It's people coming back to the farm rather than trying to get away from farm communities. So Grassland 2.0, taking all of this story that I just told you into account, our fundamental job is to inspire conversations about what's possible. And often I primarily, as the main flag waver for Grassland 2.0, I take a lot of criticism about being too prescriptive or telling people what to do. And I really don't want to tell people what to do, but we have good science, solid science, that points to grasslands as a very productive, profitable, environmentally sound solution to a lot of our problems. And so if I'm guilty, I often say, if I'm guilty of advocating and promoting for an approach here that can help us solve a lot of our societal ills, then I'm guilty as charged. And I might be a little prescriptive, but we do need to have broad conversations about what's possible and what we want out of our landscapes and what we need out of our landscapes to be healthy and to self-actualize and all this kind of thing. Grassland 2.0, I haven't talked much about this. I'd be happy to some other time, is about creating visions of a new agriculture that are based on good sound science, that are based on modeling, that, the models that get built at the university. We want to help people see what it could look like, understand what where trade-offs are and that sort of thing. And then we're all about trying to help grow agriculture in the image of the prairie. Again, this is not about just getting the prairie back on the landscape. It's about having functioning, productive agriculture on the landscape. So that's my story about Grassland 2.0. It's about restoring people and prairie functionality to the landscape. And I invite you to have a look at us online and follow us on Twitter and all that good stuff. And I'd be happy to take some questions off the chat here. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. So I am in charge of handling my own questions here. So let me just get a minute to get situated. So Todd Fansler asks, what's the biggest barrier to widespread adoption of grassland agriculture? This is a good question. It's a little bit of a loaded question. It is one of the things that we're really trying to address in the project. There's little doubt that the big elephant in the room is the U.S. Farm Bill, which, as I mentioned before, talking about payments that go to ensuring and de-risking commodity crops, and there really are 7 of them: corn and soybeans and wheat and cotton, etc. Those are the ones that get a lot of government payments and support, and so they're safe. They're not particularly profitable, but they're safe because you kind of know what you're going to expect. So that's one of the big sort of negative impediments. But there is this, I kept coming back to this idea that it's more than just profitability, it's more than just the numbers. And a lot of my farming friends that I talk to, especially the graziers, when I ask them why aren't more people doing this, like Craig Van Duvel, the fellow I talked about here, he says there's definitely this social element that is related to the narratives about what it means to be a farmer. And if you decide to go to grazing, somehow it's an implicit or tacit admission that you couldn't make it work, and you aren't living up to other people's expectations. So there's all this social behavioral element that's really important. Excuse me. Can grassland agriculture contribute? So let me, before I leave that question, because it's a really good one. One of our main deliverables, our main deliverable in Grassland 2.0 to USDA is to basically develop a plan that lists, in the very simplest version of it, that lists the impediments to getting more grassland out on the landscape, and then identifies opportunities to overcome those impediments. The main thing we're doing in Grassland 2.0 to kind of overcome those impediments is convening conversations with local community folks to discuss how might we get there, how might we get to an agriculture that's more like grassland. Okay, maybe I'm spending too much time on each question, but Todd mentioned that folks don't mind staying a little bit afterwards. Can grassland ag contribute to genuinely renewable fuels? So I didn't talk about this at all. There's a huge effort on campus, and I've been part of it, to see if we can't make ethanol out of grass. And we can. The question is, can we do it in a cost-effective manner? And I think we can. Again, I think it's more of a social, political impediment to getting more cellulosic biofuels out on the landscape. We certainly have the ability to do it. Thomas says, it seems like one of the biggest obstacles to moving towards a higher grassland mode of operation is inertia, the difficulty in changing the way we've always done things. Yes, is the Grassland Project looking at this problem? Yeah. So I started to say we are convening conversations in what we call learning hubs. We have 6 learning hubs now, 4 in Wisconsin, 1 in Illinois, and 1 in Minnesota. These are place-based conversations where we're engaging not just farmers, but folks from throughout the community in a process that we call collaborative landscape design. And that just means, like, let's sit around and let's kind of throw off the shackles of the current calculus and ask ourselves, like, if we're really designing the system and not worried about the farm bill and not worried about, what the neighbors think and all that, what would we design? And it's certainly, the conversation always gravitates to something that has a lot more grassland in it. So that's sort of the main thing that we're working on, Thomas. Wilda asks, what impact are climate change and sustainability movements having on industrial farming in the US? I mentioned this climate smart ag call that the USDA has put out. And so not only through the federal government, but state government, county government, at every level of government, those organizations are asking now, what's the carbon footprint of various systems? We're working closely with Dane County now to explore how all the land that Dane County manages, what's the carbon footprint of that? How can we get it into more grass, et cetera? So that's sort of on the public side. On the private side, of course, industries from or corporations from McDonald's to Starbucks to Walmart, they're all have awoken into this sort of sustainability space, and more are demanding genuine change from the places where they derive their products. And so this is likely going to be the biggest transformative push or pull, if you will, to making change on the landscape. It's really key, though, that they get the right push, and we can end up with some unintended consequences like we have with the renewable fuel standard, which we thought would be, well, a lot of people thought would be climate friendly, but in fact, it's been shown to be climate unfriendly. So it is having an impact on industrial farming, but industrial farming is lining up and trying to figure out how they can be responsive, and that's a good thing. Okay, David asked, these are great questions, by the way, thank you. Do you favor drastic reduction of biofuel production requirements and subsidies your colleagues seem to favor? I favor biofuel production requirements that demand cellulosic ethanol. I think that would drive a real spread of positive land use change. And I think it would really be genuinely carbon. I always get this mixed up, but it would sink a lot more carbon into soils and into the ecosystem rather than into the atmosphere. Wilda says, are you optimistic about the future of more sustainable alternatives to big ag? I am optimistic. I have to be. We have to have it. You know, and I think there's always going to be big ag. I think what you mean, Wilda, is industrial ag, where we rely on these chemical inputs and rely on fossil fuels to extract as much as we can. I don't have anything against big. I'm anti-extraction, and so this notion of regenerative agriculture has to take hold, and I think it is. It might be slower than it needs to be, but it is. Let's see, Todd. Much of American ag has evolved to a large scale, even an industrial approach. Does grassland agriculture require a return to smaller scale farming? I don't think it does necessarily. I think it opens up opportunities for smaller scale farming. It opens up opportunities for young farmers to get into the game because it doesn't require as much capital. There's less steel, there's less infrastructure, buildings, and that sort of thing. You can start a grazing operation with a modest grant and some animals and some access to land, and those aren't trivial things, but it's a lot easier to get into that game than I need a massive milk parlor and I need $2 million worth of tractors and debt up to my eyeballs, et cetera. So not only does it offer opportunities for more smaller farms, but younger farms and demographic change, like I talked about earlier. Vern says, agriculture includes agribusiness that supports intensive agriculture. What commercial interests exist or can emerge that will advocate for grassland ag? Business interests have a powerful influence. No doubt about it. And I often say in my more cynical moments that, we can complain about the Farm Bill, but the Farm Bill is the way it is because politicians make that Farm Bill, and those politicians, how can I say this politely, often have a hand around their neck, and that hand is the agribusiness industry that is actually making a lot of money off of the current system. So we know that in any system, and in this system, there are folks, organizations that are extracting an immense wealth out of the land, out of the people. And it's going to take courageous policymaking, and I say that a lot, and people say, what do you mean? And I say, it's going to take people making votes that know that it's going to probably get them voted out of office and being okay with that. That's naive, maybe, and optimistic, but that's what it's going to take. But I do think that, corporate America is coming around and positioning itself to take advantage of climate smart agriculture demand and taking advantage of demand from citizens for clean water. And the more we as people stand up and demand that with our dollar and with our votes, et cetera, the more responsive they will be. I think they would say, we give people what they want, we give people what they ask for, we've got to ask for more and demand more out of the system. Now look, what goes along with that is a really important conversation about we got to pay more for products, we got to pay for the actual costs, but at the same time, we can't do that in ways that price people less affluent people out of markets. We have to have policies that help equalize and redistribute so that less affluent still have access to high quality products. Okay, David says, is any of the Yahara Basin changes implemented through Dane County Action? Is it part of the sustainability plan? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know about the sustainability plan, so I'd love to learn more about that. Sorry. I think that's it on the chat. Somebody trying to get in there? Oh,
Right,
Ashley.
this is Todd here. I
Hi,
think
Todd.
that we've overstayed our time a little bit, but we've had some really interesting questions and responses. And it's now time to draw things to a close. Thanks to everyone who's joined us for this event, especially for those submitting questions and comments. We hope you found this time interesting and informative. Special thanks, of course, to Randy, also to Ashley Becker for arranging tonight's event, and to Ashley and Rob Colehep for their behind-the-scenes technical support. And if someone would have liked to view today's event but couldn't, it's been recorded and soon will be on the Caring for Creation page on Bethel's website. Our next Caring for Creation webinar on Tuesday, May 10th, just after Mother's Day, will highlight the activities of a group of atmospheric scientists who call themselves the Science Moms. UW Prof. Tracy Holloway, one of the group's founders, will give an overview of the Science Moms initiative, lessons from over 50 years of the Clean Air Act, and strategies to address climate change. And she'll share her own perspectives on environment, science, and thinking about the future as the mom of two boys, ages 12 and 2. Until then, good night, and may good health and the peace of God be with us all. Thank you and good night.